Welcome to today's video. It's going to be a watercolour painting of Scotney Castle, that's in Kent in England. Today what I want to do is get a bit more familiar with this paper that I'm using. It's Canson Moulin du Roy and it's 100% cotton, 300 GSM or £140, and it's rough paper. I've had samples of this, but I've never actually used the full real paper, so it'd be nice to see what it's like. As is normal with watercolour, we start from the background and work forward. So I'm putting some cerulean blue into the sky area, and this has got a lake round it, so I'm also replicating that where it's reflected. The lake reflection should be an up and down motion, whereas the sky is a much more looser kind of expression. The first brush that I'm using is a hake brush. It's a very soft wide brush. It's great for doing that kind of sky kind of work. I'm putting several layers on this, working around the building that you can see. I don't want any paint on there. So a little bit of paint got on the area I didn't want, and a dab of tissue paper, and it's gone. So I keep putting more layers on, intensifying the amount of colour. A slightly darker area with a bit of Payne's grey and Prussian blue adds a bit of atmosphere to the paint, and then I'm going to dilute that ever so slightly and bring a blue in at that end. And always remembering that we have that reflective area, so everything we do in the sky we do in the reflected area of the water. The paper's holding up really well under the amount of water that I'm adding to it. I'm just looking for areas of interest to emphasise, and I'm also starting to see bits of granulation, and you can add bits of splats and things like that to the atmosphere of the sky. And again, it's duplicating everything that you see at the top end at the bottom. Using some toilet paper, I'm going to, while the paint is still wet, nip out some of the edges and create some more texture in the sky. This helps when it's dried to make sure that there's not too many hard edges, and softens it out a bit and makes it look a lot more like cloud and sky. They're called lost and found edges, and this is one of the ways that you can create them by and it's also a good way of creating clouds as well, because you can almost totally take the paint out. Now this paper's working great with doing this particular technique, which is good. Some papers have a tendency to lock the paint in almost straight away, and that ain't always a good thing, but this paper allows you a bit of working time before it locks it in, and you can get some nice effects from that, as you can see from the atmospheric sky that I'm creating at this moment in time. I'll pick up some toilet paper and blot out certain areas that have slight pooling of water on all of the painting, and again it's that for the reflected area it's generally a downward motion. continuing to blot out, and you can still continue also to add texture while it's wet. A bit of blotting on the left side of the painting, and just as I'm thinking about this, the light is coming from the top right hand side, so when you're blotting the clouds out you want to take that into account. Moving on to some more painting. I've just added some Van Dyke brown to the blue that I've got, and that will neutralise it and turn it into a dark grey browny colour. Now that's going to help with the realism for the clouds once I get that mixed up right. Blot it off because I want this to go on slightly dry, and in various areas, taking into account that the light's coming from the right hand side, I'll put little bits of grey there. I'm just letting the brush swirl around. We're not trying to be too precise. Clouds are very random, so think in a very random way, and keep adding these bits, and you can add other colours as well, but like a purple for example, but I'll not do that in this particular case. Again, remembering to add an element of the colour from the sky in the reflected water. We add slight dabs. We don't want to go over the top with this because it's fairly far away and you're not going to see an awful lot of it. We can then dab out a little bit and take some of these dry hard edges out of it, so we've got like a lost and found kind of feeling that you would have in clouds. And once you've got that, you've got a very effective background atmospheric sky. Let's now go to the next farthest away point, which is the trees in the background, and we'll first of all mix up a very light mixture of a Naples yellow and what green is it? It's a phthalo green light. So we've got a really light yellow first, and it's important to do your light colours first and then put your darker colours over it. So I'm just mixing those light colours on, and then we're going to dab tree-like shapes, and I'm still using that big brush. Don't try doing this with small brushes, just dab it on like I'm doing there. I can work the green on this part of the painting without the blue interfering, because the blue now is really locked in, it's dried to some degree, and I'm now pulling some of that green down into the reflection. And remember, when you're doing the reflection, it's an up and down motion like I'm doing now. By painting the background blue and all the way down to the tree line, you get little bits of sky in your trees, so where there are gaps it looks like there is a gap, so it's a good way of doing that. I'm just being very careful at the moment, working around the building, that I don't want any paint on. You can mask that off if you want, but it's such a big area that it's not worth bothering about. I'm working now on the left hand side and doing exactly the same what I've done with the trees in the right side. Keep pulling some paint up, and it's more a dabbing process than a painterly brush process. Going back to the palette, I pick up some ultramarine blue and add it to the phthalo green light and make it ever so slightly darker, and this starts to add depth and dimension to the tree's light areas, so we can start to define all the different parts of the tree that are in light or in shade. And I'm also coming in front of the building here to some extent. This is a piece of land just in front of the building and next to the lake. It's a similar colour to what's being used, and again I'm also just doing a little bit of greenery next to the building itself, and any that comes down there should have a reflection also. It's still a dabbing kind of a process, but we progressively keep adding that ultramarine blue to the green that we've got and make it darker and darker, and this is how we build up glazes and carve out the shape of the trees that are around. And I'm also now going back to the other side because that will have dried somewhat, remembering that the reflection, it's always a downstroke like that, or up or down, because that has very little definition. Something that you can do at bottoms of trees is make them dark, and then the tops of the trees tend to have a lot less darkness because obviously there's more light hitting them, and we are thinking about the light coming from the top right. So that's one way of creating definition in a tree, by making the bottom part a lot darker than the top, although I am putting darker colour in that area. It, uh, when we get to the finished part of the tree, you'll find that the dark area is predominantly at the bottom of the tree. And again, get some of that colour. In this case, it's almost purely ultramarine blue, and put that in the reflection, so you've got a sense of realism. Don't be scared to add strong colours like this, as they will help towards the tonal value of the picture. Now I've done that, and that were a little bit of a mistake. It was too strong, but you'll see in a moment with the quality of the paper what I'm able to do with that. I've been able to like wash it out a little bit, and with a paper towel I can take it out a bit, and that actually adds to that reflective fuzziness that you get in water. So a little bit of an happy accident there, but that's worked to my advantage. But still, don't worry about these darker colours going in, because they do actually add to the definition and tonal value of the end product painting. Moving over to the far left trees, we'll be pretty much doing the same as what we've just done with the far distant right trees, and they're a slight bit more closer than what the far right ones are, so we might get even more definition, and that creates a sense of depth if you have more definition in your foreground trees than your background trees. I'm getting some more reflections from the trees going in there, and you have to keep reminding yourself that there are reflections there if you're doing this kind of work with water. I'm doing a little bit of foreground area there, getting some yellow, I believe that's Naples yellow in, just as an undercoat colour, that might get adjusted slightly. That, yeah, I'm putting some reeds in there, and a lot of that will get actually covered up with other foreground colours. This will be a lot more detailed than most of the rest of the painting because it is in the foreground, although there's not a lot there, so I'll not be overly concentrating on it. And then a little bit of ultramarine blue just to help with the definition, and a small amount of reflection coming up from the and you can scrape bits out as well while it's still wet. The paper that I'm testing is standing up to an awful lot of scrutiny from me. I've made some mistakes and I've dabbed them out so it can do that. I've also been able to scrape into the paper without it being too much of a detriment, and get some texture in that kind of a way, so it's really standing up to the kind of hard work I expect from a high quality paper such as this. And I'm just defining that line at the bottom where it should be quite dark now on the bottom of the trees. So please don't be scared to use a really big brush at this kind of stage, because it really helps with the realism if you've got a slight lack of control on your paint. And always remember that these darker areas, they're going to lighten up by easily 25%. So don't worry about doing things fairly dark, because it will lighten up. And you may have to go back over that because you've not quite done a strong enough wash of colour. Give the painting a bit of time to dry, because we don't want what we're doing next to bleed into the background that we've already painted. I'm now using a pointed mop quill brush to create the next section of our painting. And if you notice, when I dip into the water, which I really should have got some fresh water, I'm tapping out the water so that there's not too much. And what I'm going to do is the masonry side of the buildings, as you can see I'm doing now, I've created Naples yellow and yellow ochre for the first undercoat of painting. When you paint like this in watercolour and other painting styles, it's called laying a glaze down, and I will be taking that colour that I've created and adding that also to the reflection, because that will reflect as well into the water area. Right, pick up some paint and paint that area there. There's a little bit of a wall there, but I don't want to overemphasise it as it's in the latter stages of the painting. So I'm now doing the side wall of the building, which is again it's that mix I've created of Naples yellow and yellow ochre, but I'm putting slight little bits of mix in with that are darker and lighter, just to give it that little bit of texture. I'm doing the side of the chimney that it has, and again you follow that same principle. It's reflecting, therefore it's got to be in the painting. If you miss a bit, people will point it out and they'll go, oh, that's missing. and you'll lose the realism of the painting. Not that we're wanting to overly do the realism, but you know, if you're trying to represent a piece of art, sometimes you have to put certain realistic things in. I'm just pulling out some of the paint, which is, it's really good, this paper. It really lets you pull out sections even when it's starting to dry. Very responsive. I've got to say, I'm really pleased with the paper at this moment in time. The paper, by the way, is Canson Moulin du Roy, a 300 pound, or sorry, 300 grams, and a 140 pound weight, rough cold press cotton paper that I'm trying out, although I have had little bits of this paper to test on with. So that's what this project is about. It's to familiarise myself with the paper. I'm now mixing some more paint to that mix of colours that I've already got. I'm adding like a terracotta kind of colour, and I've made that from a red and an orange, and that will make the roof tiles, because these buildings have what they call pan tiles on the top of them, and they're like a terracotta colour. So that's how I've made that colour for the roof. Part of the building has like a red brick texture feel, which I'm trying to represent here in the part of the painting that I'm doing now. Although later on I probably will weaken that down a bit, because it's looking a little bit strong for me, that. I'm continuing to add layers and slight variations of that colour in glazes over the top of each other, in an attempt to try and create a broken up kind of effect on the wall. And sometimes you have to stop and wait with this, but I persist on with it for quite a while. We're going down to the reflective part and putting that hint of colour in it. Now, strong colours that you see are not always the colour what you will see in the reflected water, so that will be slightly different. Again, I'm going back over this orangey red colour, and later on I do actually make some major alterations to that, but you can do it with this paper because it can take a lot of punishment without it affecting the look of the paper or the painting itself. One thing I am noticing is it's very good with dry brush work, this paper, and as a rough paper it really ought to be, because that's one of the things that rough paper is really for, nice dry brush work. So just notice what I'm doing here. I'm dipping my brush in, not too far, and I'm tapping it out, and then I'm going to my paint, and that helps you with control of how much water that you're going to have on your brush, as that can make a big difference. I'll pick up a bit of yellow ochre and put that in a little background detail. It's the top of the rotund building, that, and I'm only doing one side of it as an impression, so that it looks as though strong light's hitting the other side. And using the paints that I've got, I'm starting to get a little bit of tonal definition in one side, remembering that the light is coming from the right. Anything on the left hand side is going to be darker than on the right. So that's how you create a three-dimensional feel to a circular building. And I'm also again dealing with the reflection, which has the same set of colours going all the way through it as the painting, the building above does. A colour that really holds this painting together is the ultramarine blue that I keep dipping into, and that's called a key colour. If you add that in various spots throughout the painting, it can help an awful lot with the consistency of the painting. Using some more Naples yellow and yellow ochre, I'm adding that to the deposit of paint that I've got, and I'm adding very thin glazes to parts of the painting where I need it to be slightly stronger. And what you do is you build up those glazes layer by layer until you get a series of glazes that look solid. And I'm pulling a little bit out on that reflection there to tone it down a little bit. Progressively we will add less water and more paint. We're adding a stronger mixture of red into set amount of areas in the painting. I'm going over the roof again with a stronger red just to reinforce the red in that area. And again, that's another glaze, but it's still a stronger red with paint than it is water. With also, and throughout this painting you always have to keep in mind that there's a reflection, so keep working the piece and then the reflection. Using the paint I've already got on the brush, I'm just basically marking out a key feature on the building that has a bit of red, and again I'm trying to figure out where that needs to go in the reflection, and sometimes you have to do a little bit of adjustment. Remember, everything's going to be a stroke upwards and downwards in the water, so you have to keep trying to make sure that it's like that, and it also needs to continue to be very fuzzy and not quite as strong as the original actual building. So that's another thing you need to take into account when you're doing reflections in water. I've taken some more Van Dyke brown and laid that out, and we're going to be putting that at the front of the building. There are little areas of dark and dark brown there, and obviously that will also need some reflection in that. And when you're doing reflections, they tend to be elongated in comparison to the actual thing that they are. So when something's quite large, it's not unusual, that. So don't worry about things being a lot longer than what they are in the reality. So that's the Van Dyke brown added in. I'm trying to get some bits of grey, green, blue here, and making certain areas a bit darker round that, because that would be in shadow because of the front bit that's circular. It would have a bit of shadow there. Just try and get a little bit of that reflected greenery that exists there. I'm going to pick up a little bit of this phthalo green and mix it in with some of the native colour on my palette, and emphasise a little bit of greenery in the background there that I want to do. And obviously again it's a matter of putting in the reflection as well. And we're going back, we're going to make a neutrally dark colour and come down the left side of the castle-y kind of area of the building, and that will, it looks dark now but it will lighten up a lot when it dries, but that will help in creating that three-dimensional feel later on, and help create the shadow area in that side of the painting. A little bits of turreted detail, you might see bits of that, but that will get off a little bit more. And there's the first showings of some windows of some kind, which you can see in the reference photo at the top right. And there's a little boat also. I didn't notice it at first, but there is a little boat there, so we've painted that in. Get some more dark area to emphasize that, and it's dark against light, so we're creating some good contrast. And while we've still got a little bit of wetness in the brush, we can dabble around a little bit and create some connection between some of these colours so that they fuzz into one another a little bit, as they would do in the reflection. So again, some of painting watercolour is about creating connections in the paint so that they flow a little bit, and that's basically what I'm doing there. There are some windows here, although when I look back at the actual windows, I think I've probably done them a little bit too big, but never mind, they're just windows. So again, there's a really large bay window here that I'm just basically plotting in. But we're not that far away from getting the entire painting filled with paint, and again a brief representation of that bay window in the reflection. So that's almost all of the paint in on the painting, and it's a matter of then going in with the tonal values. So there's a little entranceway or hole in the wall there that registers quite dark, and what I'm doing is starting to think about where all my dark areas are, so I can carve out some shapes that are dark to give that again some three-dimensional space. So at this halfway stage, we've got all the paint in that we want. What we've got to start thinking about is getting the tonal values into the painting now, so that we can give it some sense of dimension and bits of detail. So about now would be a good time to sit back and have a rest and do no painting. Let it dry and spend a bit of time away from it, and then come back with fresh eyes. I'm getting some background details that once that's done, it's done, and I'll leave that And obviously, again, you have to put your bits that reflect in on the water. So I'm just mixing up a little bit of reddish terracotta colour to do the reflected roof surface, because I forgot to do that little bit there. So we have to be careful about remembering to do key areas, especially when it's in reflections. And I'm using some of that terracotta again to re-emphasize the redness on the top of the round building, because that is also a terracotta kind of red. When you mix that into other parts of the painting, it can make it go quite dark, which is what I'm able to do those turrets with, a mixture of the paint and the terracotta that's ended up existing. And I'm doing a little bit of detailing work in the reflections there. Don't go over the top with this, because we are going to be doing more tones over that later. On these little bits of turreted areas of the building, I'm going to add some slight ideas of shadows that are bending round the building, which helps add towards the detail of reality of it being round. Not a lot, and I'm extending out the dark area, and slowly but surely we'll build that up to a much stronger area. Now again, this area behind that will be fairly dark because it is being totally blocked out from any sunlight by the front building. I'm adding further areas of detailing work in that greenery part of the building, and again emphasising that edge being dark on the reflection of the turret part of the building, and continuing that shadowing there. Going over the area in the reflection to strengthen that particular area, and make sure that that's seen, and picking out the details that may just be seen in the reflection, although you've got to be incredibly careful how much detail you put in there, because you don't want it to be as detailed as the actual building itself, and it is good to wash over it and blend it all in that sense. So I've moved back to the reflection for the background trees, and I'm trying to give it some sort of blended reflected effect on that by just adding water to it, and that does work quite a bit, although I'll probably strengthen that image later on. And as you can see, I keep doing that, and if you look, it's straight up and down, don't go across, it's just straight up and down for a reflection, and you'll slowly but surely build up that effect of water reflection. Again, just clear water, dragging it down all the way through the area that is a reflection. Make sure it's dragged, and you do slowly but surely build up a feel of realistic water, and that's a dragging motion just with water. Once you've got enough paint on the actual surface itself, and it does really work quite well. I'm working around the foreground area. That might have a little bit of detail at the end, but on the whole that will be the same principle as that in the background that I'm working on now. So you keep getting little bits of paint and adding that in as needed, because it's being weakened, but on the whole it's just a up and down stroke like that. Now, a lot of poorer quality papers might have started to rip up and pill by now with the amount of work that's going into this, but this paper is definitely holding up against a lot of harsh work that I'm doing to it. Moving back over to the building, I'm again just teasing the paint and adding the odd bit of ultramarine blue, which is a key colour, and a bit of red to the painting, and that will then be used to re-emphasize, and you have to do this several times to get it to a point where it is solid and strong. Parts of the building that are quite dark, but we do want the building to have an overall balance, so we'll keep going at that and having a dark area that fades into a light. Just a little bit about the paper and how I've taped it down onto a board. It's got a band round the end of it, and it's a masking tape, so that holds it down, and when it does get wet it's got no option other than to go back to where it was before it were wet, so it goes back flat. That's the reason why watercolourists tape their paper down, because if they don't, they buckle. Now this paper is actually quite, for a 300 grams or £140 paper, it's quite stiff, so it doesn't have that problem. But with other papers it can buckle, but I still tape it down anyway, just in case it wants to try. And I'm going back into that background with a dark colour now, and re-emphasising that dark area. There's quite a bit of detailing work going on in that area, just carving out various bits and the reflections for it. Back to the building. I want to do the very opposite side of the roof. Now that's going to be a lot darker than the side that we can see, but you don't see an awful lot of this side of the roof. But I'm still going to put quite a bit a strong line in there, and I'll use some of that red to put little bits of textural detail into the, I know you can't really see it in this image, but in the final picture you will be able to see lots of little bits of tiling texture in it. So, and just adding to that thought of that area being fairly dark, because of the shadow and lack of light there, that will go down right down the side of the building. But I'm just using that red as a tool to get some more darkness into the painting at that side. The paper itself, when I look at it, is a reasonably white colour, and that helps when you're thinking about highlights and bringing out brighter colours in the picture. I'm just going over with a bit of dark into various areas that it's necessary to put those. Those will fade into a much lighter area. So, that, because it sticks out a little bit, it has a bit of a shadow, but not much. And we're going round and continuing to build up the tonal value in various areas, and really that's the key to watercolour painting, getting the tonal values right, and the rest of the painting you can put whatever colours you want in, although I am going for a kind of realism in this particular painting. And again, I'm putting the details in the reflection as well, although again I will emphasize the fact that you need to be careful about what detailing you're putting in. So we're edging more into the foreground now with a bit of that darker colour, trying to carve out bits of dark area to make more sense of what that is. If you look on, I know it's a very small picture, but if you look on the reference, it has a bush that has some leaves or berries or whatever that has a red area in it, and that's what I'm putting in there. I'm just blobbing it on. I'm not trying to be hyper accurate about where that is. And at the time I felt that red were a bit strong, so I added a tiny little bit of yellow to it. But again, the small details, but sometimes they add that extra dimension, and that's some red that I'm picking up there, like a burgundy kind of red, so that acts as the slightly darker side of it. And there's bits all over, and just trying to pick out other bits of detail in this more foreground area. So we'll get some green there, and a bit of Naples yellow, and do a bit of detailing work there, start getting that to look as though it's realistic with a bit more detail. So I'm applying some light green to the foreground area, which is already quite yellowy light, but you always work from very light to dark in watercolour, because it's very difficult to work the opposite way. And once you've established your light colours, you can then work the darker areas to help create that three-dimensional space. And I'm using again the same colour in various areas, so that you've got some colour unity throughout the image. And if you notice, I'm not just doing one type of brush stroke. There's a multiple level of brush strokes that I'm adding to this. Again, I'm going the near left hand side so that you can differentiate that from the trees that are behind it. So it also helps to identify that that is more foreground than the others if you have a broader range of tonal values in things that are closer to you. So we're keeping putting those tones in, and that's really, this part of the painting is mostly building the tonal values up. There's very little paint going in. It's more to do with getting the tones, getting the dark areas and building them up. Now we've got some colour in, and again I'm creating more dark areas, building that up. Pick up a little bit of Naples yellow and add the odd splodge of light back in, because sometimes you can go a little bit over the top with it, with the dark areas, and it can create a nice organic feel as they both meld into one another. But on the whole, it's mainly dark colours that we're putting back into the painting now, and you'll see that there's very little light colour going into that area. So again, it is still a matter of adding anything into the reflection as well, and that goes for the foreground. Any water that's near the foreground, you really need to add a reflection there as well. Going back to that little boat that I didn't notice at first, I'm going to give that a bit of emphasis. And so it's a white boat, but it's got little bits of line work round it that's black. So it does have its own reflection that's a bit, you can barely see it, but it does have one. We're at the stage where we're getting a lot of dark detailing in at the moment. We've got the vast majority of the mid-tones in, so we're just trying to look at the critically dark areas, the bits that really do make the painting its darkest area. Although that line that you see me putting in there, I'm not going to leave it like that. I'm just going to put that there for the time being, and you'll see how I water that down a bit and getting a bit more of that shadow emphasised in that area. And once you see all the tonal values in place, you start seeing how that becomes much more three-dimensional. And I'm just using water now to settle the dark areas down a little bit, and we're still using some dark bits in very sparing areas of the painting. You don't put a huge amount of this very dark paint in the painting. It's about having a balance, and you know that you've got a balance if you look at the highlights. How much highlight there is in the paint should be roughly about how much darkness there is if it's a mid-tone painting. Just making sure I'm getting some of those dark detailing pieces in at the moment, and anywhere where I think that there needs a darker area fit in, I'm just applying a little bit of darkness there. Again, going back to that key colour of ultramarine blue, and adding more of that in areas, because that to me will probably be the darkest colour in the painting, even though it's not actually black. Its tonal values quite dark in its mass tone. That means when it's in its strongest mixture that you can make it. And just to emphasize that, I'm putting like a shaft of light there, or a light area. So we keep applying various little bits of detail into the painting, and just this is the hardest bit for me, just finding those little bits of detail that need finishing. Although this painting is, I won't call it a practice painting, but it is just to look at the paper and how that works. So we're moving on to the next bit. We'll pick up some more ultramarine blue, and I think I get a little bit of red there, and re-emphasize areas of once you've established certain areas of dark in the painting, you can re-evaluate the rest of the painting, and I felt that I needed to put a bit more dark in certain areas in the painting, and by this time you do actually see it in its full dryness, so you can then add more darker areas because you know how much you need to do. And I'm just making sure that that bottom part of those trees are dark, with only the tiniest amount of darkness at the top. Because I used fairly cheap masking tape, it tended to peel off a little bit from the MDF board. Now I don't know whether it's the MDF board that's creating that problem, because on other surfaces it doesn't tend to peel away, but it's got a shiny surface MDF and it probably doesn't stick that well to it. So I had to keep readjusting that down a little bit, and be careful to make sure that it sticks down, or you will get paper to bend. I'm just finishing off some little details. I mean, to be frank, these details here, I don't know why I did them. They're not really critically important in the painting, because if you look at the reference images, all the windows just look like black dots. So you have to be careful not to overdo detail in watercolour, and I feel in this particular part of the painting I've probably overdone it slightly, but they can be adjusted if needs be, and at the end of the painting, once I've done filming, I probably will do that anyway. Make minor adjustments once the painting is finally finished and dry, because you have to go back and look at it, because there's certain parts of the painting that have not quite dried the way you wanted it. I'm just going to finish off by adding a little bit more darkness to certain areas, and there's a little window there as well, and focusing on those windows. But apart from the few little odd bits of detail that need to be done, the painting is almost virtually done now, and it's that stage of the painting where you've just got to be careful not to be faffing about too much with it. So I'm not going to. I'm going to say, right, that's the end of the painting. That's me done, and that's it. I'll see you at the other side where we'll have a look at the painting. With a proper photograph, you can actually see some of the really nice detail, and I do feel with this paper, which is what the whole point of the actual painting were for, looking at the Canson Moulin du Roy, so uh, it's definitely a paper that I'll be getting more of. I might go for a slightly heavier weight of paper, and although it's rough, it's not the roughest of papers that I've ever come across, but it definitely is a very nice reactive paper. With regards to the painting, I've made some final adjustments on the building, uh, as I said I might do, and that's down to because when it dries a lot lighter, and I wanted it slightly more stronger and punchier in colour. So this has been my test run of this paper. It's also been an instructional painting, although I didn't do it to any great finish. But I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll thank you now for coming along and having a look at my artwork. We'll see you in the next art instalment. Bye.